Good evening and welcome to yet another lecture sponsored by Boogertman+Partners in the Architecture Philosophy series. I noticed an excellent turnout. It seems like mainly third years, I think. But considering this evening's speaker, I can assure you, having looked at all the stuff he's written, that it's going to be worth your while. Time certainly does not allow us to do justice in even relaying an aspect of our speaker's CV, Dr. Gerardus Adrian van den Heever, who is affiliated professor, affiliated at the Department of New Testament and Early Christian Studies at UNISA. I can assure you his qualifications, his academic research and professional training, mainly in theological studies, is impressive. His many publications and papers presented are extensive. His lecture is titled Geographies of Real and Imagined Spaces, so please welcome Gerardus van den Heever.
The term philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. This series of architecture and philosophy might not leave you with wisdom, so just be aware of that. But nevertheless, I hope we'll have some fun. Spatiality is the kind of subject or field of study that's actually a non-discipline that allows for playfulness and fun. So, let's see. You may find it at first in an age saturated by the image and so thoroughly determined by media technologies, somewhat surprisingly old-fashioned to be treated to a traditional oral presentation, a rather unsophisticated lecture. And that in a context where communication by images is part of the very profession and practice prepared for here. And I did consider seriously, I may add, to prepare a slideshow with text and images to speak to. The reason I decided in the end to forego with such media that constitute the essential trappings of contemporary communication styles is a good one, and quite fitting to the topic tonight, I think. It is this. All communication, so we now know, and occurs as the framing of utterances and representations by cultural scripts and frames supplied by the receivers of the communication to the event of decoding in the act of listening or reading. By a process of conceptual blending, the meaning that is ascribed by the recipients of the act of communication is an entirely new construct. The images that concretely construct and define for you the message delivered is the product of a two-way engagement, my input, your input, and the resulting blend. Conceptual blends, as Fauconnier and Turner defined it, are the blending of diverse cognitional frames or frame-like objects to form redefined mental spaces. There you have it, spaces. These new mental spaces are the manifestations of, and also at the same time, the drivers of knowledge as the new combinations of domained representations and insights. In short, to allow spatiality to function as a process is to encourage a new kind of knowledge construction. It demonstrates that space is about setting things in relation so as to allow new constellations of effects to take place. Spatiality, as is clear from the definitions and from the very varied studies of it, is not a discipline with its own regulatory canons of discourse and knowledge products. Space and spatiality are not things. As it is said in the dictionary definition, in the Dictionary of Geography, From the perspective of spatiality, space and society do not gaze at each other, but are rather mutually embedded. It's a verb, actually. Or in the Dictionary of Human Geography, spatiality denotes socially produced space, rather than space conceived in absolute terms. It's an event, it's something that takes place. The study of space and spatiality both inflects every other kind of inquiry and is itself inflected and informed by every other kind of study. To demonstrate the pervasiveness of spatial thinking in the broad field of human and related sciences and its intersection with many divergent kinds of scholarly studies, just refer to the entry for space and spatiality in the Oxford Companion to Law. In this entry, scholars draw from a range of theoretical sources, including queer theory, urban political economy, actor network theory, and cultural studies. And the conclusion, spatiality discourse is essentially inter- and transdisciplinary in character, because the discourse of space and spatiality touches on so many arenas for human interaction and social positioning. And since space is not neutral but an organizer for social positioning and interaction, spatial thinking operates in a broad range of disciplines. It moves in the in-between, the trans, beyond and outside of disciplinary boundaries, and hence is a transdiscipline par excellence. In a very real sense then, you will be co-creators of the address here this evening. I will not be in control of the meaning-making by decoding and framing, so that the verbal images I project here this evening are in a sense only the occasions for a very authorly and creative process of construction of meaning by invented image. So, very concretely, what you derive from this presentation, the meaning you receive and go away with, inasmuch as I set up the interaction, is an imagined meaning made by yourself. Hence, in more than one sense, this presentation is an odyssey into real and imagined spaces. And so the practice of this discourse illustrates the point of fluid space and non-spaceness, utopian topography that is at the heart of the concept of spatiality. There is, of course, also an inherent contradiction in formulating my departure point like this. This presentation literally takes place, and it takes place exactly because it is localized here in this particular space of conceptualization, and is therefore very much occasioned by the space which constructs it. Or as the little girl who, when questioned as to why she preferred to read a book rather than watch television, said that in reading she can see the pictures better. Note that by real and imagined spaces, and this is spelled with hyphens as on the poster, I push towards a slightly different application of the phrase than that in use by the American cultural critic, architect and social geographer Edward Soja and the French social philosopher Henri Lefebvre, who denoted by this phrase the process by which we project meanings and interpretations onto spaces, such that in the social imaginaire they accrue the character of space manifesting as this or that. While I fully subscribe to this understanding too, my purpose this evening is to explore a more radical proposition, namely how the real is the imagined and the imagined is the real. But to return to the other member of the topic phrase, geography, there is a good reason why an address to an audience consisting of architects or soon-to-be architects takes as its topic geography. Architecture, as the practice of arranging space through the medium of the built environment, insinuates and inserts itself into the soil into which it is established. Architecture, as the collective noun for what results from the practices of arranging space, literally becomes a feature of the physical material environment. Geography, in fact, encodes a two-directional glance like a two-faced Janus. Geography from geo, earth, and graphein, writing, represent, is simultaneously the recording of the earth, the physical environment and its features, as well as the writing of it. That is, the imaginative construction of the material environment through various practices of representation. It is with this double-sided character of the material environment that I am concerned. The fluidity and almost ephemeral immateriality itself fluidized into something much less than physical. In fact, the physical environment is not so much bruta facta as it is the creation of the imagination, in a manner. But there is more. The two sides to geography, the recognized physical and the imagined immaterial, can also exist side by side and be entertained simultaneously, as if in a cognitive disjunction. And while the latter depiction might suggest something pathological, I will argue that it is rather the contrary, namely, that it is perfectly in the order of space to take place as real and imagined. And at this point, I would like to open into the discourse on geography of real and imagined spaces with two anecdotes. The first one, a few years ago, en route to a conference in the United States, I happened to find myself in line to board the aircraft behind a well-known Afrikaans ex-actor and now film producer. He and his companion had with them a collection of paraphernalia obviously connected to filmmaking. Out of curiosity and interest, I asked him where they are off to and what they are going to film. He turned to me beaming. They are on their way to film an interview with someone on the topic of heaven. He practically gushed with enthusiasm, insisting to me that did I know that heaven really exists, that it is a place, a real place. It really exists somewhere. As experiences like this go, demands of tact and civility prevented me from openly showing my surprised incredulity. And yet, listening on, curiosity became the master of the short conversation. Apart from the obvious questions that immediately arise, where is it? How does one get there? What evidence do we have for its physical existence? There is also this. How is it possible that a nowhere place, a space so patently connected to the ideal, the level of the conceptual, the utopian counterfoil to this worldly reality, can occupy the place reserved for real spaces in the minds of an obviously intelligent person? The really intriguing thing to consider once one defamiliarizes oneself from the overly familiar concept of heaven is that a nowhere space can nevertheless be so real as to imprint its presence in the here and now. Also, and perhaps more, that it is possible to simultaneously hold for real two completely opposing worlds. The other anecdote concerns a representation that was purposely fictional but dressed up as objectively real. I refer to the recounted cartographic episode by which Alberto Manguel and Gianni Guadalupe opened their ethnography of the unreal, the dictionary of imaginary places. The following delightful anecdote. In 1923, a group of young sappers was surveying an inaccessible part of Africa. I cite from the introduction, the author's note in this book. At the end of a hard day's work under the tropical sun, a single hill remained to be plotted onto the plane table. The men were eager to return to base. It occurred to one of them that it was only a little hill and could easily be filled in by the eye of faith and a little imagination in the drawing office. The suggestion was approved. The inventive gentleman cut out a picture of an elephant from a magazine, fixed it to the map, and drew around it, creating form lines for the hill they had not surveyed. The elephant-shaped hill may still be seen today in the northwest corner of sheet 17 of Africa Gold Coast in the British 1 to 62,500 series. The recounted anecdote is itself an object lesson in the real and imagined. While numerous references to this anecdote exist, and they all refer to this book as source, the anecdote itself was not documented, and I could not establish the source of this anecdote itself. Doesn't mean it's fiction, it just means I could not see the original report. Nevertheless, the map spoken of, it does exist, and you can download it from the British Library online gallery and search for that hill yourself. Furthermore, the Surveyor General who oversaw the cartographic expedition that stretched over a number of years, Major F.G. Guggersberg, wrote an account of this survey that also served as a handbook of best practice, which includes some prescribed sanctions against exactly this kind of very fictional cartographic plotting as recounted in the anecdote. Inspecting the map, one can see why sanctions should be set up to protect the integrity of the mapping. The map, indeed the whole series, had as its purpose to project the authority of the British Empire onto the landscape in the manner it identified the spaces of, and then there's a whole long list, police stations, colonial administration centres, administrative districts, magistrates' districts, mission stations, churches, and differentiating between various denominations, mosques, pagan cult sites, chiefs' residences, roads, railroads, etc. It is, in effect, a tool for the practice of imperial management, and right in the heart of it resides an element of the fictional. Or to put it in other words, spatial hegemony is never total. Right at the heart of the hegemonic projects reside the outside, the utopian, heterotopic spaces. While one could have focused on any number of entry points into the discourse of spatiality and geographies of the imagination, I've elected to focus on a particular phenomenon only, namely that of the domain of spatial representations and imaginings, whether fictional or not, narrative or any other order of representation, and that in conjunction with the social after effects of such representations. Textual and pictorial narratives constitute one particular domain of space construction. And if you Google the term topography or anything to do with literature and space, you'll see the tremendous amount of literature devoted to this. The Dictionary of Imaginary Places is a thick book like this, and it contains references in literary works to imaginary places that don't exist. One of the entries is on Ruritania, and if you have read somewhere in your past lives The Prisoner of Zenda, you will know that Ruritania is that fictional country somewhere in the middle of Europe where the action is set. As a young teenager, I got so enamored of this story that I pored for hours over the Reader's Digest Atlas of Europe trying to find Ruritania. There's a train railway line leading from Dresden to Strelsau, the capital of Ruritania. And you know where Dresden is. It's in the eastern part of Germany. And I couldn't find Ruritania, but much to my relief, I discovered in the dictionary of imaginary places, because they had a map of where Ruritania was, that I actually searched in the right place. Only it doesn't exist. From this dictionary of imaginary places to J. Hillis Miller's Geographies, which is similar in kind, but whereas the dictionary dealt with imaginary places that don't exist, Miller's book dealt with those places, those actual places that do exist and are described and somehow feature as narrative characters in literature. There exists a corpus of literature on the representations of spaces in textual narratives, representations often called narrativized spatial map-making practices. Catherine Harmon, in her book You Are Here, Personal Geographies and Other Maps of the Imagination, shows how map-making fulfills one of our most fundamental desires, and that is to understand the world around us and our place in it. And it's not just physical environments that are dealt with here, continents, oceans, but there are also maps of heaven and hell, which I will touch on slightly later. Maps of all kinds of places, but also maps of moods, maps of effects. And what all these maps have in common is their creators' willingness to venture beyond the boundaries of geography or convention, especially where this occurs in artistic production. What makes this study on map-making remarkable is that it was published by an esteemed architectural press in the United States, namely Princeton Architectural Press. These literary cartographies enable the creation of spaces. They are a way of writing Earth and constructing the environment, but also as an inducement towards action. As Michel de Certeau, the French philosopher, said, space is a practiced place. In his chapter, Spatial Stories, in his little book, The Practice of Everyday Life. In this book, he analyzes the role of space in spatializing by means of storying, in constructing the persuasions and inducements that motivate everyday actions. Embedded in spatializing through storying or narrating are operations of orientation, situation, and temporalization. This happened here. This is the history of this place. This is related to that. Stories do things like that. In short, place, what appears to be the stable emplacement of fixed object in fixed spatial arrangements vis-à-vis each other, is infused with effect, with value, so much that space is the intersection of conflictual programs and contractual proximities. Stories place objects in landscapes and temporalize them, or insert them into history, and conversely create history through creating spatial and temporal relationships between objects. By changing places into spaces, stories organize the relationship between places and spaces, and in this manner, stories and narratives direct action. Performance of narratives thus creates, as de Certeau puts it, theatres for action. It does not necessarily mean that you read a novel and you are induced to do something. But somehow, literature as a whole, as a wider encompassing discourse, does encode certain motives for action. It sets us up to value certain things instead of others. It is thus not my intention to argue that every spatialized narrative necessarily functions as exaltation, or solely as that, but rather to indicate that the spatial representations as travelogues play into a context where spatial relationships are defined, and these include social space as the perceived relationship between participants in the discursive agoon. Agoon is a Greek-derived term for context. Turning now to more my world of ancient literature, one of the most foundational narrative representations of our Western conception of the space that is the West, arguably, is a two-part Homeric epic, and especially for our purposes here, the Odyssey, the second part of the Homeric epic. And you know basically what the Iliad and the Odyssey refer to. It's the 10-year-long war between the Greeks and the Trojans. The ending of the war, disaster for Troy, its destruction, and then in the Odyssey, the 10-year-long travel back home by the hero Odysseus. But in the course of the Odyssey, Odysseus visits almost every Greek city, almost every Greek island between Greece and what is now Turkey. So as a storied geographical account of Greek places, it weaves together a network of geographic references to places and the mythic traditions encountered, rooted in them, which together define Greek identity. And all the Greek gods appear in the Odyssey. They are all somehow encountered in the course of this travel narrative. Added to that, the fact that the Homeric epic is also evidence for the new reordering of the Greek pantheon. Between the time of the historical Trojan War, about 1200 BCE, and the writing of the epic itself, about 850 BCE, fundamental shifts took place in Greek religion. In short, the pantheon of gods was reconstituted. After creation, according to myth, Uranus and Gaia, sky and earth, ruled as gods. But then there's strife between Uranus and his children. Gaia inspired one of them to castrate his father, Uranus, and then Kronos, who did this, he ruled in his space. Then Kronos again imprisoned his children, and he was overthrown by Zeus. Now, before Zeus' ascendancy, according to myth, ascendancy to divine rule, humankind experienced a blissful existence in the Golden Age under Kronos' rule, without pain, death, disease, hunger, or any devil. So it's a romantic retrojection of there was a paradise sometime way back when. With Zeus' rule, an end came to humankind's happiness. And scholars of religious history agree that this mythical gigantomachy expressed on the narrative level the fundamental changes that took place in Greek self-definition, identity, and religion. In effect, by recounting Odysseus' travels and adventures, Homer constructed the Greek world of his time. The way the epic works is to delineate geographical and spatial contours in such ways as to convey pertinent cultural meanings, while also staging diverse scenarios of intercultural contact. That is, the Homeric epic literally makes possible intersocial and intercultural interaction through a process called geopoetics. This comes from Marius Kempis and Ioannis Tsilgas, the book Geography, Topography, and Landscape, in configurations of space in Greek and Roman epic. As they put it, every story has its place, and epic is concerned with representing spatial dimensions. Epic storytelling comes into existence by describing persons' movements through space, and geography counts among the constitutive elements of the cultural system, each time inscribed into the vision of the epic world. So, by narrating movement across spaces and places, you create a sense of Greek space. This is our world, our identity. But this epic didn't end here, it had an afterlife. The later exuberant over-the-topness of retellings and complete fictionalized versions of the Trojan epic, such as Dio Chrysostom's Troikos Logos and Philostratus's Heroicus, overturned the traditional account of the war in that the Greeks turned out to be the barbarians and Troy never defeated. Complete wholesale inventions of the Trojan history by making the Greeks the guilty parties and apportioning innocence to the Trojans. Because by then the invented versions served to underscore the heroism of the early imperial Romans, who derived their lineages from the Trojans via the escaped hero Anchises and his son Aeneas, as recounted in Virgil's Aeneid. While the fictional accounts of Darius the Phrygian, Acta Diurna Belli Trojani, and the Ephemeris Belli Trojani of Dictys of Crete encoded Greek criticism of Roman rule, the later versions subsumed the Greek world under the Roman imperial rule. Explorations of space took off in another direction as well, namely in the genre known as historic paradoxographical literature. In short, literature containing fictionalized rewritings of history, but wholesale refictionalizing and falsification of history. Utopian tales, curiosa about the natural world, and ethnographic armchair travelogues, most completely fantastical fabrications. The implicit social discourse inherent in this historico-paradoxographical literature is demonstrated by the island settings chosen for late Hellenistic and early Roman description of utopias. In these narratives, like Euhemerus' story of the inhabitants of Pangaea, an island in the Indian Ocean, Jambulus's account of his stay on the island of the Sun, also in the Indian Ocean, which is a pseudo-scientific description of utopian life on an island in a state of nature, based on egalitarian principles, exactly what did not obtain in the late Hellenistic kingdoms. The presence of strange and symbolic animals, where inhabitants are welcome so long as they reach their own level of perfection, and the account of Dionysius' Skytobrachion of the utopian islands, one in the west called Hesperia in the Lake Tritonis, beyond the columns of Hercules, that is, it's beyond Gibraltar in the Atlantic Ocean, and inhabited and ruled by the Amazons, and the other Nisa, the island in the east, the birthplace of Dionysus, the god, where Dionysus was supposedly brought up. The utopias are located outside the normal order of things, where nature and social order are inversed. They constitute imaginary topsy-turvy worlds where nature gives up its bountiful fruits automatically, without the need for human toil and agriculture, where humans live in egalitarian harmony without a particular social organization, in blissful isolation uncorrupted by contact between communities. In spite of being the kind of account satirized by Lucian of Samosata as extravagant fantasies, these narratives present the reader with a social critique of contemporary imperial society. The late Hellenistic empires with the Roman Empire in the ascendancy. Importantly, they were not confined to a Greek readership. These and similar utopian fantasies circulated in Latin as well. Euhemerus through the translation of Ennius and Manilius, and the Admiranda, a work of antiquarian curiosity written by Licinius Mucianus, consul and kingmaker of Vespasian, the Roman emperor from 69 to 79. It is in the world of Latin literature that these utopian fantasies had the longest and most far-reaching influence. And this is really, for me, the interesting bit. If the Roman general Sertorius desired to escape from the horrors of the civil war to the islands of the blessed beyond the columns of Hercules, he did so on the strength of sailors' tales about their gentle climate and luxuriant growth of edible fruits. He was acting out the utopian and social fantasies that were beginning to circulate in the visions espoused by writers like Horace and his contemporary Virgil. So you see here that you can read literature and it's purely fictional, and somehow it exerts such a grip on the imagination that you actually go in search for those places and you act out this fantasy. The obvious importance of these island settings of utopian fantasies derives from the fact that they represent the extremities of the known world. Moreover, as extremities, they represent the transgressed boundaries into the world of the fantastical, as seen in Lucian's The Wonders Beyond Thule. Thule is actually the ancient name for Iceland, somewhere way back there. It's as the modern equivalent would be to recount a narrative that sends the action into outer space. It's way beyond the furthest limits that we can attain to. But there is another aspect to them, and this is seen in the emerging imperial myths that justify the divination of the emperor, especially when one compares the self-promotion of the first Roman emperor Augustus with the Hellenistic doctrine of divinization. And it is this that he is the emperor because he surpassed the achievements of the god Dionysus, who was everywhere, who traveled from India right across the whole Mediterranean world in a kind of conquering travel. The Greek word was an anabasis. So that because he was way beyond the limits of the normal, way beyond what the humans can aspire to, that is exactly why he is divine and why the emperor is a god. A few centuries later, in the 5th century, now already in the Christian era, the epic poet Nonnos of Panopolis would compose the massive epic, the Dionysiaca. It's massive because it's by a few thousand lines longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's the longest work of written literature ever produced. An epic that recounts the trek of Dionysus through the whole of the known world from India through the Mediterranean. And this poem is essentially a compendium of all the known Greek myths from the ancient world. But it inserts the god Dionysus as main actor into all the mythical episodes. The Dionysiaca is significant in more than one sense. It testifies to the rise of Dionysus to the most important deity in the Greek world by the 5th century, and by then the other gods have retreated into the background, in a development that is now understood to be a mirror of the rise of the cult of Christ in the Mediterranean world. Also, the Dionysiaca unites the whole of the Mediterranean world and Mediterranean spaces deep into the Orient, into a single geographic narrative space that is more or less coextensive with the later Roman Empire at its height. And to an even greater extent than the Homeric epics, The Dionysiakos serves as the compendium of myth and identity-making resources for later Greco-Roman self-identifications, by means of its situating of the imperial deity into every significant place and event of Mediterranean history. The Dionysiaka is the thesaurus of later Greco-Roman cultural repertoires. So what I'm describing here is the fact that it's not innocent, in a way, to fictionalize your world or to project space into narrative. It rearranges, in the end it becomes a discourse that rearranges your world. It created an imperial ideology. It created new versions of religion. And that is apart from the fact that the empire itself was literally built into existence. It projected itself through monuments, through inscriptions, through buildings, through open spaces. It projected its own authority and hegemony into that world. So all these things just go together. So it doesn't really matter, real, imagined, real. It has very real effects, and they exist side by side. Taking the concept of travels up to a virtual dimension, the period from roughly around the mid-2nd century BCE to the 3rd century of the Christian era, but in fact it extends beyond this date in marginal cultural locations and into Islam, in pre-rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity, saw the rise of the genre of apocalyptic literature. And the reason why I refer to this is because one particular feature of apocalyptic literature, and one that occurs quite regularly through the whole corpus of these kinds of writing, is that of travel through space. Literally space. It's usually an angelic intermediary that collects the seer up, takes him, it's usually a him, into heaven, shows him all the heavens until you reach the highest heaven and see the heavenly court where God resides. And it's usually recounted in the very same images as the imperial court in Rome. The same kinds of circles of courtiers, etc., etc. One important feature of apocalypticism is the tours of heaven undertaken by a visionary who is the voice in the text, who gains in this manner access to the hidden world of the divine plan, which includes insight into how history will play out. The texts are often narrated visions. Since apocalypticism is social critique, the central vision is commonly the restored temple, or the heavenly city as the restored city. A particularly good example is from the Bible, the very last book, Revelation chapters 17 to 22, the climax of the grotesque visions of the book of Revelation. Revelation 17 to 18 describe the fall of the imperial city of Rome under the label of Babylon, the great whore and the beast, the imperial power and its armies, its instruments of oppression and the merchants, the marine traders, the client kings, all benefited from the luxury built on the bodies of the poor, that is, of course, Christians. Then Revelation 19 to 20 describe the final battle and vanquishing the anti-divine forces and restoration of the vindicated downtrodden. The last two chapters, 21 and 22, portray the restored city, the heavenly Jerusalem, after the paroxysm of violence and bloodshed. Of importance is the way in which the city is described, a perfect cube and impossibly big, but built from and adorned with all the jewels and precious stones known in that world, and shining like polished glass, that is, it is radiant, it is a symbol of glory. From its middle flows a river, and it contains a miraculous fruit garden. And both these elements, the bejeweled building and the river with garden, evoke Persian images from the time of the Persian Empire and the Achaemenid dynasty. It's about 400 years to 500 years before. The royal inscriptions from Bizitun, as well as the palace inscriptions from Susa and Persepolis, boast how noble metals and precious stones were used from all over the empire to build and adorn the palaces. On the one hand, the purpose was to have the whole of the empire in all its provinces connected into the royal palace. And on the other hand, it was to show that palaces are marvels, places of wonder. The garden evokes the Persian concept of paradisos, pardush, whence our concept of paradise, which is a walled garden laid out in the middle of the palace precinct with water furrows to cool the garden that contain typically all the plants and trees found in the empire, and stocked with exemplars of all the animals in the empire. The Persian palaces and paradisal gardens were meant to project the power and prestige of the Persian Empire. What one finds then in this narrative in the book of Revelation is a kind of contest between the Persian practices of literally empire building and the visionary city of Revelation, which is a contest between two alternative visions of society. They encode social visions from opposite ends of the social divide. The intense emotionality attaching to visions of the imperial city and the restored heavenly city in Revelation testifies to the fact that cities, urban spaces, spaces in general are not neutral in effect. Space is effectively charged, and this effect constructs the experience for us. And then just a final remark on another kind of city. It is by transgressing boundaries that humans gain insight into their mundane spaces as living contexts. If we move from outer space to imagined space, I would like to move to another imagined space, equally a city, the represented city of Metropolis. The film Metropolis, a German expressionist science fiction film, was made in 1927. It was based on a popular sci-fi novel of the same name. The story is set in a future city where the wealthy, rich industrialists rule the city from high-rise complexes, and in which a class of laborer servants toil in underground spaces to generate the power that runs the city. The story concerns the son of a rich industrialist, Freder, who falls in love with Maria, a servant worker. Freder follows Maria into the catacombs beneath the city and experiences the bone-crunching conditions of the workers, even encountering a female cyborg figure who incites disturbances among the workers. After much to and fro, Freder and Maria find each other and are instrumental in making peace between the classes. So that's the whole point of the story. It's a class conflict. The building that houses the headquarters of the industrialist, Freder's father, Frederiksen, is deliberately depicted like the Tower of Babel, as painted by Griffel, and as evoked by Maria in the course of the story of Metropolis. Now this is significant because that shows that the film is actually a social commentary on the Germany of its time. The film originated in the context of the social disorganization that was the last years of the Weimar Republic, and which saw a steady disintegration of the social fabric. The film thus comments on the social context of its time. And while Expressionism was later denounced by the Nazi regime as degenerate art, it did not preclude exactly the film's approval and appropriation by the Nazis for its message of anti-bourgeois and anti-capitalist social reordering. The director of the film, Fritz Lang, was married to the author of the original story, Thea von Harburg. Now she became a supporter of the Nazi Party, while Fritz Lang, the director, later distanced himself from the film. In effect, we have in Metropolis another Babylon next to the imperial city of Rome as the Babylon of Revelation. In fact, so paradigmatic did the name Babylon become that it is proverbial for degeneracy, corruption, and exploitative oppression. Now, I mention this because very recently there appeared a book was published by Sabine Hacker on Berlin at the time of the Weimar Republic, and the book is called Geographies of Class, Modern Architecture and Mass Society in Weimar, Berlin. And the sources she draws on to reconstruct what Berlin was in the time of the Weimar Republic, all derive from the same period, all contemporary to the film Metropolis. She draws on, for instance, from the side of architecture, Martin Wagner's planning initiatives, Erich Mendelssohn's buildings, the texts, famous texts of the period, Alfred Döblin's novel Berlin, Alexanderplatz, and Walter Ruttmann's city film Berlin, Symphony of the Big City. So she draws on all these critical, philosophical, literary, photographic, and filmic texts to reconstruct the urban imagination at this point in the history of German modernity. It's a very conflictual history. It's of still dealing with the demise of the German Reich, the empire of Kaiser Wilhelm. It's a society that disaggregates. It doesn't handle modernization and urbanization well. So that it illustrates how representation of space actually plays into how we understand and project social space, and how these negotiations take place by means of artistic and cultural production. Traversing space-making projects like these, we see how space engenders culture, and how culture-making in turn constructs space as lived space. In another context, I said, culture is a site of social and political positioning, a site of contention. In other words, the political toil of imagining ourselves as positioned in a specific manner vis-à-vis all other imagined communities, and in doing so drawing on a multitude of symbolic interventions in order to effect and maintain this positioning and identity. Culture is a conflictual term. We think culture is the kind of jeans you wear, the designer labels you wear, the music you listen to. But in all these things, count them together, they say something of how you see yourself as placed vis-à-vis others. We have different kinds of identity markers. The discussion here is intended to set the tone for a further reflection on space and spatiality. But I also suggest that once one ventures into this kind of exploration, one ventures into an transdisciplinary exploration into all the discourses that constitute the study of spatiality. Space does not just exist. It is constructed through complex and multi-layered processes. The layeredness requires looking at space and spatiality from different angles and through various kinds of lenses. So if I may end with a citation from the famous Edward Sojar in his book Post-Metropolis, I would like to leave this with you. Places are products of collective human action and intention, and therefore susceptible to being modified or changed. This infuses all socially constructed scales of human spatiality, from the local to the global, not just with activity and intentionality, but also with built intentions and potential conflicts, with openness and freedom as well as enclosure and oppression, with the perpetual presence of geo-historically uneven development, and hence with politics, ideology, and what, borrowing from Michel Foucault, can be called the intersections of space, knowledge, and power. Thank you.
As contemporary people are so used to social media where you have imagery where you like and you unlike, I think this has probably been a very good exercise for change. There's an oral exercise beyond it. Nevertheless, I'm sure this oral gym has posed some questions for you. So are there any questions or comments to Professor Palingana?
I just want to know, are you at all involved in any projects that are actually experimenting with these theories of place that you're talking about related to this city and this country?
No. I've only a very superficial exposure to some of the discourses about this in South Africa. But that has to do with my own academic background. My work's in classics and religious history, and it's by a big coincidence that I actually landed into spatiality theory, the rhetoric of space, etc. I first worked with applying, seeing that how this is applied in the analysis of aspects of the Roman imperial society and early Christianity, etc. I arranged a conference last year in Greece with the title Spatializing Practices. And while its intended end product was a redescriptive companion to Greco-Roman antiquity, some of the presenters actually did work with contemporary examples, fascinating examples in the Balkans, in Slovenia and Hungary and Finland and so on, how people define their boundaries and their rooted identity through spatializing practices. Well, it's something that I know it should be done. I just haven't done it yet.
More questions?
Well, there's actually something that I hope someone will do a systematic study of this. But what is the effect of changing a town or a city's name? What is the effect of changing street names? I mean, it's not new. It happened in the Greco-Roman period as well. New kings called towns by new names. That's not the issue. But if you change a street name or a city name, by implication you write a part of history out of consciousness. You don't see it. One of the aspects of collective memory just disappear. What are the implications or the long-term effects probably of that? To everyone involved. The people who see their names disappear and others who see their names appear. What eventual negotiations may take place and what does it mean? I often think back to what happened in Rwanda in 1994. I mean, the genocide didn't suddenly happen, but over a period of time, using all kinds of cultural media, Hutu cultural agents, wrote the Tutsis out of society by dehumanizing them. Then just once you remove people symbolically from society, you may also remove them physically. These are just the things I think someone should investigate.
Okay, well then, there's Isha appreciation to Professor Lefa, whose valuable contribution for us to consider the agenda of the architecture.